In 1846, in the wake of the annexation of Texas a year earlier, America went to war with Mexico. There was much opposition to the war, already driven by the sectional rivalry that would pull the country apart in 15 years. The nation saw support for the war in the southern states and opposition in much of the north. But the war went forward. This conflict did not involve invasion or insurrection within the U.S. borders. Therefore, President James Polk could not call the militia to federal service. The war must be fought by the Federal Army alone. At the war's beginning, the Army had about 6,000 regulars. Volunteer regiments swelled the ranks to 115,000. American forces quickly captured New Mexico and California in 1846. Then, in March 1847, General Winfield Scott led the first major amphibious landing in the history of the United States Army at Veracruz, Mexico. Among the 14,000 men following him were Robert E. Lee, George Meade, Ulysses S. Grant, James Longstreet, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, though that nickname was still more than a decade in the future. Leaving part of his force behind, Scott pushed on toward Mexico City with about 8,500 men. A few months later, Scott's men defeated the Mexican forces in the Battle of Chapultepec, capturing Mexico City. The American soldiers had won all major battles in the war with Mexico, but success in that war may have made the next one inevitable. The struggles between free and slave states, already causing deep divisions in the Union, would become even more intense. The massive lands that Mexico surrendered in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would ratchet tensions further than ever. And the American soldiers who had just captured Mexico City together would soon face one another as enemies. Before the fighting even began, the Confederacy had already recruited one of the nation's best generals. In the years following the war with Mexico, Robert E. Lee was made superintendent of his beloved United States Military Academy. As states began seceding, his old commander, General Winfield Scott, approached him about taking command of the Union forces. But Lee could not bring himself to fight against Virginia, and he resigned his commission with the Army when his state seceded from the Union in April 1861, after the capture of Fort Sumter. President Lincoln responded to Sumter by calling 75,000 militia into service to defend the capital and demand the return of the Confederate States. But decades of inactivity by the militia meant that few of these men were adequately supplied, trained, or experienced. Unfortunately, those 75,000 90-day volunteers did not perform well in the first major battle of the war.
We called to them, tried to tell them there was no danger, called them to stop, implored them to stand. We called them cowards, denounced them in the most offensive terms, put out our heavy revolvers and threatened to shoot them, but all in vain. A cruel, crazy, mad, hopeless panic possessed them and communicated to everybody about in front and rear. The heat was awful. Although about 6, the men were exhausted. Their mouths gaped, their lips cracked and blackened from the powder of the cartridges they had bitten off in battle, their eyes staring in frenzy. No mortal ever saw such a mass of ghastly wretches.
Thus reported Ohio Congressman Albert Riddle after witnessing the rout of Union forces at the First Battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. The day after the rout at Bull Run, Lincoln signed a bill calling for the enlistment of 500,000 volunteers to serve 3 years. Just 3 days later, he signed a bill raising that to 1 million. General McClellan would train these new men into one of the best fighting forces in the world, the Army of the Potomac. But he would struggle to command them effectively, as would other commanders, until finally General Ulysses S. Grant took command in 1864. When the guns fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the federal government had about 500,000 shoulder arms held in arsenals in northern states. About 80% of these were 69 caliber smoothbores. The southern states possessed only about a third as many long guns, many seized from federal arsenals, and again, most were smoothbore muskets. These included old Model 1816 and 1822 Springfield flintlock muskets, some of which had been converted to the percussion system and some not, as well as Model 1842 muskets, which were manufactured as percussion guns from the start. Both sides could raise more troops than they could quickly arm, and there was a massive effort to build or buy as many guns as possible. But the Union didn't just need guns, it needed men to fire them. With the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union began to actively recruit black soldiers into its ranks. In May 1863, the War Department created the Bureau of United States Colored Troops, tasked with recruiting African Americans to fight. Almost 200,000 blacks enlisted in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. They served in the United States Colored Troops, newly created by the order of the Secretary of the Army, and included black regiments of all types: infantry, cavalry, and artillery. By war's end, the USCT represented about 10% of the Union's total forces. They fought for many reasons, but obviously, one powerful incentive was to strike a blow against the forces that had enslaved millions of their fellow African Americans. By taking up arms to join the fight, these men were not waiting to be freed. They were freeing themselves. The war dragged on, longer than any had expected. Grant's promotion to Lieutenant General in charge of all Union forces in March 1864 put in motion the campaigns that would bring the war to its bloody conclusion. This included sending General William Tecumseh Sherman, named in part for the great Shawnee war leader who had opposed America in 1812, to march his armies across Georgia and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean, laying waste to all Confederate assets along the way, including the city of Atlanta, the heart of the South. Grant himself would focus on General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, centered around Richmond, Virginia. By June, Grant and his generals were in the Richmond-Petersburg area and were digging trenches. Actions around Petersburg and Richmond continued through the fall and even into winter. A series of skirmishes and smaller battles were occasionally producing victories for the Confederacy, but were wearing away at Lee's resources. In April of 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia had been seriously weakened. After 4 years of war, rebel soldiers were worn down. Food shortages and disease had taken their toll, and more men were disappearing in the night, leaving behind a shrunken army. Then the Union forces finally broke through at Petersburg. Grant later described the attack.
We kept up a continuous artillery fire upon the enemy around the whole line, including that north of the James River, until it was light enough to move, which was about 4:45 in the morning. At that hour, Parks and Wright's Corps moved out as directed, brushed the abattis from their front as they advanced under a heavy fire of musketry and artillery, and went without flinching. They mounted the parapets and threw themselves inside of the enemy's line.
Grant had ordered continuous artillery fire along the enemy line throughout the night of April 1st. At 4 o'clock in the morning on April 2nd, the 9th and 6th Corps would attack along their respective fronts. The 6th Corps assaulted the Confederate trenches along Boydton Plank Road. The initial attack of the 9th Corps was successful, capturing 3 Confederate batteries. The Southerners were low on manpower. Their line was stretched thin. The Ninth Corps had overrun the Confederate trenches. With that one break through the Confederate lines, the Southern defenses around the city were indeed untenable. After 9 long months of trench warfare that would not be seen again until World War I, the siege of Petersburg was over. The Confederate forces had withdrawn into the city's inner defenses. Grant planned another artillery bombardment to begin at 5 a.m. on April 3rd, followed by another assault an hour later. But General Robert E. Lee evacuated the city in the night. Within 2 weeks' time, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse.